we proceed now to our next topic, that is the tax system and tax law. So first, we define what is a tax law. A tax law is a set of rules that provide means for the state to raise revenue. So basically, a tax law is a law passed by Congress to raise revenue for the government. So our tax law here in the Philippines is codified. When we say codified, it is only placed in a particular law. And what is our tax law in the Philippines? It is known as your National Internal Revenue Code. Now, we learn what are the different sources of tax laws. So, what are the sources of our tax laws? So first, we have your Constitution. So guys, although actually this is a misnomer, a Constitution is not actually a source of tax law. So why is your Constitution not a source of tax law? It is not a source of tax law because, guys, Constitution are more of limitations. They are more of limitations than grant of tax power. Why again? Because tax power is inherent. So more of limitations yung Constitution. Next, we have your legislative enactments. So what are legislative enactments? Legislative enactments are your Republic Acts. Ito yung RA blah 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 blah, RA blah 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 blah. So Republic Acts. So these are enactments from the Congress, which is passed as law. Enactments from the Congress, which are passed as law. Next, we have your Supreme Court decisions. So what are your Supreme Court decisions? These are known as your jurisprudence or case law. It is provided under our Constitution that the decisions of the Supreme Court forms part of the law of the land. Okay. So when can we say that your SC decisions is a source of tax law? So your decisions of your Supreme Court can be for a tax case, So if that is a tax case decision, therefore, there is a tax law. Because again, the decision on this tax case is a law under our land. So under Philippines, it is considered a law. So whatever is a decision on the tax case can form part as a tax law. Next, we have your administrative issuances. So what are these? These are issuances by the proper administrative body implementing the rules and regulations of a general law. So what is our general law again? NIRC under tax. So if ever we say that is an admin issuance, we issue a tax law based on the administrative agency which is granted the power to collect and assess taxes. And that is your BIR. So yung BIR, mag-i-issue na siya ng rules and regulations for our law. And normally, these rules or regulations are known as your revenue regulations. Ito yung mga RRs ninyo, RMOs, and RMCs. So these are different regulations provided by the BIR. Next, we have your BPs and EOs. So what are BPs and EOs? BPs are batas pambansa. So guys, if ever makakita kayo ng BPs, ibig sabihin yan na napas yung law na yan during the martial law. Why? What happened during the martial law? During the martial law, the power of legislative, executive, and judiciary was lodged primarily only to one person, and that is in the nature of Marcos. So, naibigay kay Marcos yung three branches of government. So, what are the three branches of government? Legislative, executive, and judiciary. Lahat yun, kinokontrol na ni Marcos. So, Marcos can draft law, Marcos can implement it, Marcos can also try to understand the law by the judiciary power. So here in our BPs, it is a law passed during the Marcos era. So nung martial law yan. Pag nakakita kayo ng batas pambansa, ibig sabihin na past century sa martial law. So, it is unique kasi it is the first time na yung president mismo ang gagawa ng law. Next, we have your EOs, executive orders. BPs kasi is not applicable now. When we say not applicable now, the president cannot give BPs. But the PPs provided before by Marcos is still existing up to now. But as of now, our president cannot provide BPs because he does not have the power of the legislative. The legislative is still in the Congress. But the president can issue EOs. What are these EOs? These are the executive orders or different orders of the president. So EOs, yun naman yung parang quasi-legislative ni president. Sir, why quasi-legislative? Kasi pwede rin siyang magbigay ng law niya pero under EO. Hindi siya pure na legislative kasi hindi siya yung power of the Congress. So parang delegated power lang siya. Next, we have your tax treaties. These are different agreements made by different states as to the treatment of taxes. These are different agreements made by the states as to the treatment of taxes. So for example, Philippines and Australia. Philippines and Australia can enter into a tax treaty to not tax persons coming from Australia, yung pumunta sa Pilipinas na galing Australia, wag i-tax. At the same time tayo, na coming from Philippines na pupunta sa Australia, hindi ita-tax ng Australia. So that's an example of a tax treaty. That is an example of tax treaty. Okay? So that is those are the different sources of tax law: Constitution, legislative enactments, SC decisions, admin issuances, BPs, and EOs, tax treaties. Okay. So after learning our tax laws, we proceed now as to our tax system. So what is the Philippine tax system? So first, we determine what is a tax system. A tax system is a system of taxation, particularly for the process or methods on assessing and collecting taxes. So remember, we have your levy, we have your assessment, and we have your collection. And here, when we say system, it is pertaining to assessing and collecting taxes. Therefore, this is your tax administration. Now, basically, your main question here is who administers the collection and administers the collection and assessment of taxes. So the agency tasked to administer the collection and assessment of taxes is known as your BIR, or your Bureau of Internal Revenue. Okay? So who administers the collection and assessment of taxes? It is known as your BIR. So remember, the assessment and collection or the administration of taxes is a function of executive. So when we say function of executive, again, it is under the president. So we have your president. Your president has your cabinet secretaries, and these cabinet secretaries are known as the alter ego of the president. Because guys, I hope by now you know that the different departments under the government is controlled by the president. But how can the president control them? Hindi niya naman pwedeng hati-hatiin yung sarili niya dun sa mga gobyerno yon. So it is controlled through the cabinet secretaries. So the cabinet secretaries are the alter ego of the president towards the different departments. And the cabinet secretaries are heads of the different departments. So for example, we have your DOJ, DNR, and Department of Finance. So your DOJ, DNR, and Department of Finance are some examples of the departments under the president. So the heads are, of course, coming from your cabinet secretaries. And your DLF, is still formed on your different bureaus. So under DOF, meron pang ibang bureaus. So for example, you have your Bureau of Internal Revenue. You have your Bureau of Treasury. You have your Bureau of Customs. So these items are under the Department of Finance. Now, the Philippine Tax System or the tax administration is administered by the BIR by the supervision of the Department of Finance. Sir, why is it under the supervision of the Department of Finance? Because again, take note, BIR is under Department of Finance. BIR is under Department of Finance. Sir, is that only provided by the President or was it embedded in a law? Actually, this is provided by our law, the NIRC Section 2. NIRC Section 2. And you will learn soon that from Section 3 until Section 22 of the NIRC provides the different functions of the BIR, So, since we already know that the BIR administers the assessment and collection of taxes, then we need to learn what are the powers of the BIR. So the powers of the BIR, again, is provided under your NIRC, particularly sections 3 until sections 22. So first, power of the BIR. That is the assessment and collection of taxes, because again, they are, the law provided that the BIR has the power to collect and assess taxes. So we already know what is assessment, and we also know what is collection. Next, the BIR has the power to enforce judgment in all cases decided in its favor by the courts. So we already learned this one a while back, that in case there are cases in courts and the court will decide in favor of the BIR can enforce those judgments. Next, giving effect to tax laws. We also learned this already. So the BIR can give effect on your tax laws through your administrative regulations. So these are your different RRs, RMOs, and RMCs. These are different RRs, RMOs, and RMCs. So they give effect as to our tax law. So if ever, this is also known as the quasi-legislative power of the BIR. Sir, why is it known as the quasi-legislative power of the BIR? It is known as the quasi-legislative power of the BIR because they form part also of our tax laws. So although BIR is not the legislature itself, meaning hindi siya Congress, pero they can make tax laws by virtue of the delegative authority from the Congress. Diba sabi natin, general rule levied by the legislative. Exemption, if there is a delegation to the President, to the LGU, and to the administrative supervision. And who has administrative supervision over our tax law? That is the BIR. So by the BIR, we have your different administrative regulations. That is the quasi-legislative power of the BIR. Next, assignment of internal revenue officers. What do we mean by assignment of internal revenue officers? When we talk about assignment of internal revenue officers, we mean that the BIR can transfer any revenue officer from one place to another. So for example, the BIR can transfer an officer coming from Batanes to Sulu, and an officer coming from Sulu to Tuguegarao City. That can be. Why? Because that is a function of the BIR. That is the power of the BIR. Normally, the BIR does that to deter any fraud and familiarity among the officers and the taxpayers. Because if ever there is a fraud already, or there is a familiarity in between the officer and the taxpayers, what happens is, of course, there can be a fraud or an evasion due to the officer. So, alam nyo na yung mga nangyayari ngayon, yung instead of paying the right taxes, binabayaran na lang lesser taxes, basta may ibigay dun sa officer. So, nangyayari yun due to familiarity. Pag kilala mo na masyado yung mga nandun sa BIR mismo. Next, power of the BIR, that is the provision and distribution of forms, receipts, certificate stamps to proper officials. So what happens here is that the BIR will distribute these different documents to different entities to ease the collection of taxes. So for example, guys, documentary stamp tax. Do you know a documentary stamp, DS, or documentary stamp? How can we make an example of a documentary stamp? Have you ever been into an arcade? Okay, so in an arcade, normally you earn tickets, and the tickets, they have this small form. Or have you ever went to a circus? So may mga tickets doon na maliliit din. Ano pa ba? Basta yon, yung yung maliliit na tickets. So parang ganun lang yung stamps. So yung stamps na yan, nilalagay kasi yan sa mga documents. So pinipaste yan sa documents. Ano bang document ninyo na aring may stamp? What do you call this one? Diploma. Your diploma has a documentary stamp. Yung brown, tapos parang may what do you call this? Logo ng government. Ano pa ba? Transcript of records din nyo. May stamps din yon. Okay? So, normally, we distribute, or the BIR distribute it to ease the doing of business. Also, forms. Example, before, we can only pay our taxes directly to the BIR. So, lahat ng babayaran mong taxes, gaano mang kalaki yan, diretso mo sa BIR. But now, we can pay our taxes to banks. So, banks can accept our payment of taxes. So normally banks also have forms for the payment of taxes. So these forms are provided by the BIR to the banks. Okay. So again, to ease the collection of taxes. Next, issuance of receipts and clearances. So what are these issuance of receipts and clearances? So only the BIR has the power to issue receipts as to the payment of your taxes. So sir, how about if I paid to the bank? Will it not be the bank to give the receipt? No. Actually, ang makukuha mo lang kay bank ay yung deposit slip. And the deposit slip is a proof of payment of the tax, which you will proceed now to the BIR. So upon giving to the BIR will give you a receipt and a clearance. What is this clearance? Tax clearance. Have you ever went to a particular business establishment, and inside that business establishment, there is a BIR tax clearance. So those are clearances. Okay? Issuance of receipts and clearances. Another, submission of reports to the Congress. So what are these reports? Normally reports by the BIR for the lawmaking power of the Congress. So the Congress will consider the report regarding the current tax situation in the Philippines. So with that report, the Congress can change a tax law, can amend a tax law so that it would make a more proper or good system of taxation. Okay, so those are the powers of the BIR, again, provided under the NIRC. So, question, who exercises this power of the BIR? So, nasabi naman na kanina natin, di ba, BIR through the CIR. Okay, so who is the CIR? Under Section 3 of the NIRC, the CIR is the chief official of the Bureau of Internal Revenue. Who is the CIR? It is the Commissioner of Internal Revenue, he who heads the BIR. So the CIR has 4 deputy commissioners. So why is there a deputy commissioner? Normally, the deputy commissioner is used for the different sectors. So parang siyang sectoral ng mga heads. So the sector head of operations is 1 deputy commissioner, sector head of legal enforcement, 1 deputy commissioner, another deputy commissioner for information systems, and another deputy commissioner for resource management. But again, the powers of the BIR is exercised by the Commissioner of Internal Revenue together with its 4 deputy commissioners. Okay, so after knowing the power of the BIR and it is administered by the CIR, we go now to the express powers of the CIR. So this express powers of the CIR, again, is provided under our National Internal Revenue Code. So the first power of the CIR is to interpret tax laws and decide tax cases. To interpret tax laws and decide tax cases. So what are these interpretations of tax laws and tax cases? Remember, I told you if there is a protest coming from an assessment by the taxpayer, the CIR can decide on that tax case before it can go to the court. So why interpret tax laws? Because the tax law will be used to solve the tax case. Next, to obtain information, to summon, examine, and take testimony of persons. This is, of course, because of the first power. Because of the first power. So, due to the first power, you can now summon information. You can also summon persons. Next, to make assessments and prescribe additional tax requirements for administration and enforcement. Of course, the CIR can assess. And finally, the CIR can also make its own rules because of its quasi-legislative power. So nasabi naman na natin kanina yan, di ba? Because of the quasi-legislative power of the CIR or the BIR. Next, to conduct inventory taking, surveillance, and to prescribe presumptive gross sales and receipts. What is this inventory taking? That happens if ever, guys, under our, if ever a taxpayer understates its ending inventory. So ano ba nangyayari dito sa inventory taking? So pag nagbigay ka ng iyong income tax return, ang ginawa mo doon sa ending inventory mo, binabaan mo. So dahil binabaan mo, ano mangyayari sa cost of sales mo? Mas mataas na kasi nga mababa yung ending inventory, mataas ang cost of sales. But actually, hindi naman. So bakit ba ginagawa yan? Para ma-lessen yung ating taxable income. The higher the cost of sales, the lower the income. So this is the power in case the CIR has a knowledge that a particular business enterprise or an individual makes a fraudulent amount as to your inventory. So with this, the CIR can just really compute or count the real inventory of the taxpayer. Next, surveillance and to prescribe presumptive gross sales and receipts. So kailan tayo pwede magbigay ng presumptive gross sales and receipts? Pwede yung presumptive gross sales and receipts only if there is no records on the amount of sales and receipts. Okay, so only if there is no record on the amount of sales and receipts. So you can make a presumptive amount. Sir, what is the basis of that presumptive amount? The basis of that presumptive amount is from the previous sales or receipts. So based on the previous sales on receipts, we try to forecast what is the amount of the sales or receipts this year. So, okay, we try to make a presumptive gross sales or receipts based on our forecast on previous sales or receipts. Next, to terminate taxable period. So what do we mean by the termination of the taxable period? So if we say we terminate the taxable period, we end the tax period of a taxpayer. Because guys, there is a presumption under the law that if ever you did not terminate your tax period, you are taxable during the whole year. You are taxable during the whole year. So since you are taxable during the whole year, in case there is already a termination of your taxable period, matatax ka pa rin the whole year. Bakit nga ba? Kasi ganito, halimbawa, business ka. You are a business. And then you end your business on September. So January to September, October to December. So if you will not terminate your business by the BIR, so if the BIR will not terminate your business on September, it means that you are taxed the whole year, January to December. Sir, question, paano kung zero naman yung income ko dito, matatax pa rin ako? Yes, because guys, even zero ang income mo under our tax law, kailangan mo pa rin mag-file ng tax return. And the non-filing of tax return, may babayaran ka. Because of the non-filing of tax return, may babayaran ka tuloy. Okay? May mga penalties ka. So, the BIR or the CIR must terminate your taxable period. Sir, when do we terminate the taxable period? When do we terminate the taxable period? So the taxable period is terminated during, first, of course, the retirement on business. Another is in case there is fraud of an individual. Fraud of an individual. In case the individual wants to conceal or obstruct any collection of tax, wants to conceal or obstruct the collection of tax. And lastly, an individual lived or left the Philippines. So pag umalis na yung individual. So when can we terminate the taxable period? If there is a retirement on business, if there is a fraud of an individual, and if ever an individual left the Philippines. So fraud of an individual in case that the individual conceals its tax or try to obstruct the collection of taxes. So you can terminate the taxable period. So you end the tax period of a taxpayer because again, general rule, a taxpayer is taxed during the whole year. So other powers of the CAR, first, to prescribe real property values. So what is this? Number 6, real property values. So this real property values is known as your zonal values. So what is this zonal value? So normally the Philippines will be divided into different zones and we prescribe a value per zone. So a value per zone is prescribed. So for example, zone 1, 300, zone 2, 500, zone 3, 600, ganon. So per zone, we prescribe a particular value. That is a power of the CIR. Why? Because under our taxation, especially in the taxation of real property, we measure it at the higher of the zonal value and the fair market value. The zonal value and the fair market value. Next, to inquire into bank deposits account. The inquire bank deposit accounts. So when do we inquire on bank deposits? We only inquire on bank deposits. This is an exemption, by the way, this is an exemption to the bank secrecy law. So general rule, you cannot just inquire on bank deposits because of bank secrecy. So the bank cannot divulge information to other persons not authorized by the owner of the bank account. So here, into inquiry in your bank deposits, this is an exemption to your bank secrecy law. This is again provided under our tax code. This is again provided under our tax code. So since this is already provided by our tax code, hence it can be done without even the authority of the owner of the bank. So when can we inquire into bank deposits? When can we inquire on bank deposits? That is, first, if ever we want to compromise tax liability on the ground of financial incapacity. So you already know this one, right? Financial incapacity and compromise. Next, to determine gross estate of decedent. So what do we mean by determine the gross estate of decedent? So remember guys, diba, pag may namatay, ito transfer yung property nung namatay to is tagapagmana. Ngayon, para malaman natin kung magkano ba talaga yung ita-transfer, kailangan natin malaman kung magkano pa yung pera ni namatay dun sa bangko so that it will be taxed properly on estate tax. So only 2 instances to inquire into bank deposits. Next, to accredit and register tax agents. So when do we register and accredit tax agents? Guys, it doesn't mean that if you are an accountant, you are already a tax practitioner. Before you will be considered as a tax practitioner, you must first be accredited by the Bureau of Internal Revenue. So you must first be accredited really and registered as a tax agent. Ninth, to prescribe additional procedural or documentary requirements. This is again in consonance with the rule-making power of your CIR or the BIR. And 10, to delegate power to subordinates. So in short, out of the 9 powers that we discussed, guys, I know, I look into your textbook and there are 15 powers that was enumerated. I think 15, 14, I just don't know the number. So those items were already embedded in all of our discussions from 1 to 9. So more of parang ini-specify niya, but actually embedded na siya dun sa na-discuss natin. Okay, so in number 10, you can delegate power. So in short, from 1 to 9, we can delegate it. We can delegate it. Is that the rule? No. We can only delegate certain powers. So what powers are not delegated? So the rule is, from 1 to 9, you can actually delegate it, except non-delegable power. Except non-delegable power. So what are the non-delegable power of the CIR? So we have 4 non-delegable powers of the CIR. First, that is the power to recommend promulgation of rules and regulations. What is this again? This is the rule-making power. Second, the power to issue rulings of first impression. What is this again? In case there is a tax cases and you will rule on that tax case. Why do we say it is a ruling of first impression? It is a ruling of first impression because it is the first time to settle an issue like that. So if ever you are confronted with an issue and it is the first time that you will settle an issue like that, that is a ruling of first impression. So we already discussed also that one. Next, the power to compromise or abate tax liability. Again, this is the power of the CIR to lessen the burden of tax, to lessen the amount of tax. Number 4, the power to assign or reassign revenue officers. So we said a while back, only the CIR can reassign or assign revenue officers from one place to another. Okay? So these are non-delegable powers. So again, from the enumerations, general rule, we can delegate. The CIR can delegate. Exception, non-delegable power. So what are the non-delegable powers of the CIR? We have 4 items, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So please try to familiarize yourselves with the power of the CIR and of course, the non-delegable power of the CIR. We go now to the quasi-legislative and quasi-judiciary power of the CIR. We keep on mentioning what is quasi-legislative and quasi-judiciary. So what is the proof that there is a quasi-legislative power of the BIR? That is your revenue regulations, RMOs, and RMCs. So what is a revenue regulation? And what is an RMO? And what is an RMC? So we start first with a revenue regulation. So a revenue regulation, again, is a rule and regulation provided by the BIR to implement the NIRC. To implement the NIRC. Nasabi naman na natin to kanina. Okay? So these are different rules and regulations to implement the NIRC. So from a general law, that is an NIRC, we try to implement it using rules and regulations. So we call them revenue regulations. Next, we have your revenue memorandum orders. Revenue memorandum orders. These are only directives by the Bureau that is in effect for the regulation of the BIR. So these are only internal regulations. These are only internal regulations. So again, these are issuances or directives by the BIR for internal use or regulations. So this may be a method, procedure, process, whatsoever. These are RMOs. Next, we have your RMCs. So these are different issuances by the BIR relating to laws, regulations, etc. So we try to issue portions of laws and regulations. So these are only certain issuances. Unlike revenue regulations, you need to issue a regulation for the whole general law. Here, in your RMC, certain lang. So example, gusto mo lang Section 18. Section 18 lang nung NIRC, edi Section 18 lang yung laman ng RMC mo. Ganun siya. Okay? So RRs and RMCs apply outside, while RMOs applies as to internal regulations. So para siyang law within the BIR. So how about quasi-judiciary? So when we say quasi-judiciary, here we exercise judiciary power. We exercise judiciary power. But why is it quasi-judiciary? Because again, our judiciary power is within your SC and the lower courts. It is quasi-judiciary because the BIR can also resolve tax cases. Diba? Sabi nga natin kanina, pag may protest, yung BIR or yung CIR, yung magro-rule dun sa tax case na yun. So what are these quasi-judiciary powers of the BIR? So some examples are your RMRs or your revenue memorandum rulings. So these are the rulings or opinions regarding tax laws and a set of facts or cases. So these are rulings regarding tax laws and cases. How about your BIR rulings? These are positions on different issues, raised by a taxpayer. Issues raised by a taxpayer. Okay, so we know now that BIR is both a quasi-legislative. Why? Because it also exercises rule-making power. How about quasi-judiciary? Because it exercises judiciary power. Okay, so what are the instances wherein we can see there is a quasi-legislative and quasi-judiciary power of the BIR? RMOs, RMCs, RRs, RMIs, and BIR rulings. Maybe you can also find revenue bulletins. These are only notices within the BIR. And actually, they can be informed part of RMCs or rulings also. RMCs or rulings. Okay, and we go now to your escapes from taxation, or second to the last topic, escapes from taxation. So why do we say that these are escapes from taxation? Because the tax burden is escaped. This tax burden is escaped. So you have a tax liability, but you are not to pay the tax liability. Okay, so you are not to pay tax liability. And in paying or not paying the tax liability, that can be a tax avoidance or tax evasion. When we say tax avoidance, this is a legal permissible mean, or it is a legal means or escape of taxation, while tax evasion is illegal. So we have different forms of tax avoidance. First is shifting. This is the same with the concept of VAT. We shift the burden of taxation from one person to another. So we try to shift the burden of taxation from one person to another. So what happens in a shifting? This is more of like your indirect tax a while back, di ba? Tina-transfer natin yung burden to other persons. So example yan ay VAT. Next, we also have your transformation. So under your transformation, we transform the production process to recoup the tax. So we transform the production process to recoup the tax. So what happens here is instead of shifting the tax, to avoid the amount of tax, we try to reduce the production process. So what happens here is we reduce the cost of production. So for example, our normal tax is, let's say we have your sales, we have your cost, and we have your tax. So our net income is 200, 150, and 30. Our net income is 20. Now, let's say there was an increase in tax. It is 40 already. We want to still get the 20 net income. So we want to recoup the tax. How do we recoup the tax? Kailangan mo daw bawasan yung cost. So kung ang sales pa rin natin ay 200, magkano lang dapat yung cost mo para makuha mo pa rin yung 20? 140. So we reduce the cost to recoup the tax. That is your transformation. Last type of tax avoidance is your capitalization. And under your capitalization, we just try to capitalize the tax. We just try to capitalize the tax. Okay? So we try to adjust the value of your asset and capitalize it in your asset. So that is a capitalization. We go now to your tax evasion. We said your tax evasion is illegal. When we say illegal, this is a escape on your taxation. However, it is made fraudulently. It is made fraudulently. Why is it made fraudulently? So you defeat or lessen your tax with the intent of fraud. With the intent of fraud. So if ever you will ask me, what are the instances we can say that there is a tax evasion? Actually, guys, there is no hard and fast rule regarding the determination of tax evasion. Because, guys, the determination of tax evasion is the work of the judiciary. So it is the judiciary to say whether there is a tax evasion or not. So what is the main point so that we can say there is a tax evasion? The main point so that we can say tax evasion exists is that there is an employment of fraud. So if there is an employment of fraud, generally, there is a tax evasion. So if you don't pay taxes and there is an element of fraud, that is or can be considered a tax evasion. Okay, so we go now to the concept of tax exemption. What is the concept of your tax exemption? The concept of your tax exemption is an immunity, privilege, or a privilege of not paying tax. So there is an immunity on the burden of tax. So instead of paying tax, you don't pay tax. We call that tax exemption. We call that tax exemption. Okay, tax exemption is also known as your tax holiday. And remember, for your tax exemption, this must be provided by the law, or the Constitution. So, for example, there is a local ordinance that exempts me from tax. Does it mean that I will not pay any tax to the BIR? No, guys, because again, we talked about our tax laws a while back. Our tax laws should come from the national laws, and our national laws should apply to all. And your local taxes are only certain exemptions on the locality itself. So kung exempted ka dyan sa Tugigaraw, exempt ka lang sa Tugigaraw. Exempt ka sa Baguio, exempt ka sa Baguio. Pero as to national taxes, remember we have two, national tax or local tax. So local tax ka ng exempt, national, no, ganun siya. And since it is provided by law or consti, remember the doctrine of strictissimi juris. Under your doctrine of strictissimi juris, the burden to prove that there is really an exemption is towards the taxpayer. The burden to prove that there is really an exemption is towards the taxpayer. Kaya nga sabi natin, tax exemption is construed strictly against the taxpayer and in favor of the government. So to prove that there is really an exemption, you need to point out the law or the provision of the Constitution that really exempts you on the payment of tax. So here, there is really an exemption of tax. So what are the forms of tax exemption? First, we have your condonation. Here on your condonation, it is the same with the concept in your, what do you call this one? Obligations and contracts, wherein the amount of your tax is already condoned. The amount of your tax is already condoned. When we say the amount of your tax is already condoned, you have no tax liability already, or there is already a forgiveness of tax liability. But guys, normally if there is a condonation, hindi yung buo, kinokondone lang nila yung a certain portion of your civil liability. Bakit civil liability? This is a civil liability arising from tax. Amnesty naman is a condonation also, but however, in amnesty, we have an amnesty on your civil and criminal liability. So normally, pag may criminal liability ka arising from taxation, we have your amnesty or pardon. So katulad nung issue ngayon, di ba may amnesty na binigay or pardon? So ganun lang din dito sa tax exemption na to. Amnesty or pardon out of the criminal liability. Sir, why do we say it is a form of tax exemption? Because guys, you do not pay or there is an escape on the burden of taxation. there is an escape or a burden on the burden of taxation. So instead of paying the burden, you do not pay. Okay, so you're exempted to pay by virtue of condonation, by virtue of amnesty, or lastly, by virtue of incentives. So we call this tax incentives. So these are other exemptions provided by the law or constitution. So example, exemption of our PWDs and senior citizens over VAT, and also a 20% discount on them. So if ever bibili sila, may 20% discount sila. At the same time, exempted pa sila sa pagbabayad ng VAT. Okay? So these are different tax exemptions or forms of tax exemption: condonation, amnesty, and incentives. So we end our second part of introduction to taxation in this topic.